While Paul was in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also, some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own prophets have said. For we are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Okay, well, as Lisa said, we are now at the midpoint of the 6 weeks of looking at the Bible to figure out methods of sharing the faith that we are proclaiming in the season of Easter. And the really good thing about all of these methods is they are proven to work because they have been shown to work in the stories we read in the Bible. So you don't have to go to school. You don't have to make big changes in your life. They are there ready for us to learn from. And once you know what they are, you can discern which works best for you and then begin to use it. So before we explore the next method in this series, I thought we'd take a brief look at where we have been. So, what are the methods we've already learned about? Well, the first one is to share an experience you've had of God. And we learned this one from the woman at the well. You'll remember she's foreign. She is a Gentile, not a Jew, and she has some precarious home circumstances. And despite all this, she is the one whom Jesus seeks out to encounter at Jacob's well. So Jesus and this woman share a moment together, and she is so inspired by this experience that she's had of him that she goes and tells her whole village that she thinks she might have met the Messiah himself. The point is, we all have experiences of God, don't we? We know him. We live in the assurance that he knows us. That's important. All you have to do is pick the most meaningful experience you've had, the one you feel most passionate about, the one perhaps that's changed your life the most, and describe it to folks who haven't had or aren't sure they've had a similar thing happen to them. So that's method number one. Then we took another look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, well-trodden ground, I know. But here the message was letting people know about who God is by serving people for Him in His name. For Jesus, love and service are essentially the same thing. They are one of the most powerful ways to share what you believe about God. And that's simply to notice what God notices, to notice what your neighbor needs, and then do everything you can in your power to supply that need. And if people are wondering what's driving us to care for them, well, then that's an open door, isn't it? We can tell them that the God we worship calls us to love each other in practical ways, ways that matter. So that's method number two. Then last week we looked at the power of invitation by watching how Jesus' invitation to Philip to come and see was passed on to Nathanael with the very same words and led ultimately to his coming to faith. Inviting someone to have anything to do with faith is a big deal because what we're really doing is inviting them to meet Jesus. So we explored how to offer an invitation by first deciding what you feel is most meaningful to you in your faith life, where you sense Jesus is moving most powerfully, and then inviting them to experience that with you. And by the way, we also talked about how we each have an important role to play in making sure that those who accept our invitations, when they come to worship or a Bible study or a service event or a fellowship thing, that those of us who are there are prepared, are ready to meet them with the care and the notice and perhaps the compassion that Jesus calls us to show. So whenever we are on this campus, we are ambassadors of the hospitality of God. And that is an important thing to remember. So that's where we've been. What we're going to look at today is a fascinating story about sharing faith by first finding common ground. One reason Paul, I think, is so effective as a missionary is he has a foot in both prevailing cultures of his day. He is born into the Jewish faith. He is educated as a Pharisee. But he is also, it so happens, a Roman citizen. And thus he has standing in the pagan world. So when he's talking to Jews, he can speak to them as a Jew. And when he is addressing Gentiles, well, his Roman citizenship gives him a place in Gentile culture as a launching pad to forming important relationships with them. But interestingly, neither of these two identities, maybe citizenships, is really much use to him where we find him in this story today. Because he's in Athens, and Athens is kind of ground zero for classical Greek philosophy and religion. Athens is the symbolic home of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato. Sacrifices to the Greek gods are still being made, and adherents to the Stoic and Epicurean schools can still be heard arguing in the streets of Athens. You probably wouldn't find that in the Jewish homeland. In other words, when Paul arrives in Athens, he is really kind of out of his element. And being out of his element is exactly how the Bible describes his initial efforts. As is his custom, he finds the local Jewish community and he begins to evangelize them. Why? Because he knows them, right? It's like speaking to like. He speaks their language. He understands their customs. That's where he goes first. And he doesn't get very far with them. So he goes into the marketplace. If the synagogue is not going to welcome him, then perhaps somebody in the marketplace will welcome him. And so he begins talking to ordinary Athenians, as well as Epicureans and Stoics, who paint him as a babbler, which is pretty serious coming from a philosopher. It means you're talking nonsense. It means that what you're saying isn't worth listening to. But what he's saying intrigues enough of them to have them invite him to speak at a place called the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus, you can visit it today, it's still there, is essentially a big rocky outcrop in Athens. In fact, that's what the Areopagus means, the big rock of Ares. It's also known more popularly as Mars Hill. Mars is the Roman name of the god of war, the Greek god of war, Ares. And legend has it, if you were walking the streets of Athens, they probably would have told you that this is where Ares, the Greek god of war, was tried for the murder of one of Poseidon's sons. That is part of the Greek mythology. Anyway, because of this, the Areopagus was used as a place, as a law court, but it was also a place literally to give people a hearing. If you were invited to the Areopagus, it meant that the people who were coming to hear you speak were going to listen carefully to you. You had somehow earned their attention. And Paul knows this. And so Paul shows up ready to meet the moment. Now, it would be tempting and actually a little more dramatic to, wonder that Paul, on his way up to the Areopagus, passed by all these different altars to various gods and decided on the fly to compose a brilliant presentation of the Christian faith. But that would really sell Paul short. We're told about how distressed Paul is about the far-flung and deeply held idolatry of the Athenians. As a guy steeped in Jewish monotheism, this would really have shaken Paul. The fact is, Paul does more than just notice this. Paul pays attention. Paul goes to school. Paul does his homework. So he takes the time and the effort to learn about the Athenians and their way of being religious before presuming to engage them in a conversation meant to persuade. And this effort, this curiosity, this willingness to do the homework necessary to make an impact gives him the possibility of success talking with people who are religiously and culturally completely different from him. There was a commercial running a few years back advertising software to help people learn a foreign language. I actually think it was called Babbel. He's accused of being a babbler. Maybe it was Babel, I don't know. But anyway, it told the story of a Midwest farm boy who somehow struck up a friendship with an Italian girl that had turned into something more than a friendship. And he, as a farm boy, he's planning on flying to Italy to rejoin his girlfriend and meet her family. And so he gets this software, whatever you call it, and starts learning Italian. The commercial ends with him coming face to face with his beloved and greeting her in her native language. And in the background, you can see the family react with surprise and delight and perhaps a little bemusement that this American farm kid has honored them by learning a little of their language. It establishes a bit of common ground, and according to the commercial, it works. You know, when most of us were kids, we didn't have Facebook, where you could read all about a person in a few mouse clicks. I think now it's called internet stalking. So, right? Come on, we can be honest. We did it the hard way, right? If you were interested in somebody in junior high or high school, what did you do? You deployed all your friends to gather intel on, in my case, her. And I wanted to know who her friends were, what music she liked, where did she like to hang out after school, what were her favorite movies. This was valuable information. And we probably didn't know it at the time, at least I didn't, but what were we looking for? We were looking for common ground. We knew we needed to know this stuff. Why? To show we were interested. You put the work in to make your chances of success as good as they could be. I mean, if you were serious about another person in your school, you did this work. In both cases, the work up front for the farm boy and for myself translates to interest and respect and maybe a little bit of admiration. It establishes a piece of common ground from which more common ground can be discovered. You got to start somewhere, right? It's important in establishing relationships of any kind, really. And we might even do it without even thinking that we're doing it. But when it comes to establishing common ground for the purposes of sharing faith, then the odds go up that we're going to really need to establish this common ground carefully. So, what are you doing by establishing common ground? Just this. You are earning the right to be listened to. You are earning the right to be heard and taken seriously before you start talking about important things. And this is what Paul does with the Athenians. He does the work. He takes the time. He gets to know them first. And not just on a surface level. I mean, he really does know the Athenians when he shows up on Mars Hill. So it's not that he just happens to walk by an altar to an unknown god and go, oh, what? There's my approach. No. And by the way, you can Google up altars to unknown gods. These are real things, and we have lots of them. Apparently they were very well known, very well dispersed. You can go to museums and see written in all different kinds of languages to an unknown god. Both Greeks and Romans, by the way, worshipped gods who were very human in their habits and especially in their weaknesses. They were capricious. They were liars. They were double dealers. They enacted revenge using their godly powers so they could be benevolent and they could be vindictive and generous and selfish. And the point was, you didn't want to get on the wrong side of any god. So as a bit of insurance, I think, Greeks and Romans worshipped even the gods they didn't know. And altars to unknown gods are the result of them hedging their bets a little bit. So that's the background to unknown gods. Well, Paul uses this Athenian anxiety about that unknown god to open a conversation with the Athenians about a God who can be known. See what he does there? His distress at Athenian idolatry isn't expressed as criticism or a put down or as him despising them. I mean, who responds well to any of that? I mean, you can feel that, but it isn't useful in finding common ground to express any of that. And so what does he do? He finds a way to express admiration for their seriousness in their religiosity. It isn't important at this stage that their religiosity is heading in the wrong direction. It's important for Paul to hold that out to them as a way to begin a conversation about faith. He starts his explanation of faith with a compliment. Now, this is not, something he's putting over on the Athenians. They were keen enough to smell that out. So whatever he's saying and however he's saying it is coming across as authentic. And establishing common ground of attention to and reverence for God, Paul then introduces them, listen to this, to a God they're already worshiping. This unknown God can be known. He has a name, and Paul supplies it. Jesus is the creator, the giver of life, and all Athenians are his children. Even their own poets have been singing about this God for generations, perhaps without even knowing it. In the Bible, in whom we live and move and have our being is in quotation marks, and this is an editorial device to indicate that the translators believe that Paul is citing something that has already been said. So he's done enough work, Paul has, to know what their poets are singing about this unknown God. It's brilliant, if you think about it. So Paul doesn't go all the way to Athens because he doesn't care about the Athenians. No, he goes to Athens precisely because he cares very much about them. And what he brings with him is an understanding about who they are and what's important to them, and an idea of what they will listen to. It isn't just he just blurps out some, carbon copy recitation of the faith all his buddies back in Philippi are saying every Sunday as they worship the God they know. No. He is tailoring his presentation so that it can be received, so that it can be heard, so that it can be understood. It's not simply enough to say Jesus is Lord. In some cases, you might have to define your terminology, and certainly to till the ground so the seeds you're planting actually find a home, take root, begin to grow. So he knows about their altars, he knows about their philosophy, he knows about their poetry, and even a little something of their anxiety, right? They're anxious not to upset any gods. That's why they've got altars to unknown gods. And he puts all of this to work in one of the greatest bits of cross-cultural faith sharing, I think, ever recorded or known to humanity. You can do the same thing. You can do the same thing. And you don't have to learn anything new, and you don't have to go anywhere. What you need to do is relatively simple. Number one, know what your interests and passions are, because this is the common ground you're seeking with others. One of the most usual bits of wisdom shared with people who are looking for that special someone is, take a class. Take a class in something you like. If you like ceramics, take a ceramic class. If you like watercolors, take a watercolor class. If you like molecular biology, take one of those classes, right? Because what are you looking for? Everybody else in that same class shares something with you now, right? They share ceramics, or they share watercolors, or they share molecular biology. So you are finding common ground. So know what your interests and your passions are. If you have a group you go to the symphony with, or you're in a book club, or you're part of a travel group, or a walking group, or whatever it is you're in, well, your common ground is already under your feet. I've used the fact that I like to target shoot and hunt and fish and sometimes have some spicy red wine or a good malty beer or maybe a drop of bourbon to open conversations that I later used to share faith. And I'm far from the first. Benjamin Franklin said that beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. I agree. I'm not sure I'm right there as articulate as old Ben is, but hey, it's a start, right? Martin Luther said this: whoever drinks beer, he is quick to sleep. Whoever sleeps long does not sin. Whoever does not sin enters heaven. You know it's coming. Thus, let us drink beer and go to heaven. He really said that. The point is, whatever God has given you to love and to be interested in is potential common ground. And you already have it. I'm not asking you to go out and find a hobby, unless you want to. Everything you need, you already have. You're already there. Number 2, be interested in the interests and passions of others as well. You see, this is what Paul did. He brought with him an understanding of God. He brought with him a love of his fellow human beings. He brought that with him. He didn't have to find that in Athens. But he was also interested in the mechanisms of faith of other people. So he combined those two to establish a foundation upon which, well, he built a church. So be interested in what others are interested in. Invest in your relationships. Don't know anything about quilting or cricket? Well, be willing to learn from somebody who loves those things, and you'll have common ground before you know it. Now, before I met Kristen, I didn't know much or even care much about German culture and language, well, past the Reformation anyway. And then I met Kristen. And she was an exchange student. When I met her, she was just a semester removed from Germany. And getting to know her and becoming interested in her, guess what? I became interested in German culture and the German language. Why? Because they were both important to her. They were important in her life. It was a life I wanted to share with her. It was a life I wanted to be a part of. And you might say, well, Rev, it was easy for you because, you were interested in a girl. One of the great motivators of history. Well, you're right. I was. And I'm here to tell you that I got the girl. And I'm a lucky duck. But I'd also say to you that using what you love, or what you want to love, or what you might be willing to love to create common ground for sharing faith results in more than the love of your life. What it results in, yes, is a relationship. But the relationship is with God. It is eternal. It will never end. Every relationship we have in this life will end. Except one. And that's the relationship we have with God. And in that relationship, every other relationship is available to us. But without that one relationship, well, every other relationship does end, right? So the things we're talking about, the things we're sharing, are eternal things. And they will mean the difference forever. And that's why we look for common ground, because it's a way to share what we believe. And please don't misunderstand me. Looking for common ground, even creating common ground, isn't ever to fake somebody into a sham relationship just so you can sick Jesus on them. That's not what I'm saying. Because I believe that you cannot share authentic faith through a make-believe relationship. People are too keen. People can smell that out. And even if you could do that, it wouldn't be the right way. You share authentic faith through authentic relationships. You share your real faith through real relationships. By caring about people and investing time in them and getting to know them and valuing what they value, even as you offer what you value to them, right? This is just relationship stuff. We all know this on some level. We can all put it to use. I dare say we've all experienced it in one way or another. We understand that to share meaningful relationships, you need to earn the right to be heard, just like Paul did in Athens. And how do you do that? You do that by being real and trustworthy and listening yourself and being there when it counts, forming a real relationship and doing things in real relationships that real people do. And there may come a time where this work you've put in can bear the weight of a conversation about eternal things. And when it can bear the weight of eternal things, God says, go. Don't be silent. Take your best shot. Don't do it out of coercion. Don't do it out of, some thing you're trying to put over on the other person. Do it out of genuine caring, genuine interest, and genuine love. Because the thing we know about God, if we know nothing else, is that God is love. He's real love about everything, for everyone.